Hello everyone, Dr. Feist here, and I'm still talking about the Nicomachean Ethics. Now I'm digging into Book 1, Chapter 1. So, the opening is basically Aristotle starting with an observation of how people talk. A report, if you like, about human activities. So how do we talk about human activities is basically his opening. So don't automatically assume that Aristotle is giving you his opinion or making any serious assertions yet. Those will come later on, but he's not in any rush. It's sort of a leisurely opening, but it gives you a flavor of the book that Aristotle will be looking at what, in fact, people say. And we'll see later on that he considers that a very important way of learning about ethics is to listen to what people say about it, especially if you can listen to the wise. Always a good idea there. So try not to jump to conclusions. Think about it as Aristotle not rushing to the point, so you shouldn't either. So Aristotle notes that it's said that human activities, various ones, such as art, inquiry, action, making choices, are done with an aim to some kind of good. So human activities then, human activities, choices, making choices, all kinds of things, they have an aim at some good in mind. That's why we do things. So they aim at some good. And he goes on to say something like this, that some people have moved from this notion of activities aim at a good to that there's some good that all the activities aim at. Now, he says that this is a well-said thing. So he's not necessarily disagreeing with it, but he does say that, wait a second, there's all different kinds of ends. So human activities, they come in many kinds, and they have all kinds of ends, goals. Aristotle's word would be tele for the plural, or telos for the singular. And I'm writing these out in just Roman script here. But the notion of a telos, which is an end or a goal of an activity. So some things are done for the telos of an activity. You practice the piano so that you can get better at another activity, namely playing. So you don't always do things for the sake of a particular object. Sometimes you do them for the sake of an activity. Yeah, I want to be a good piano player, so I practice a lot. And then there's other things. It's possible that the telos of practicing piano would be the playing of piano, and to do it right, to do it correctly, to do it well. So it's possible that the activity is what you're after. Some things are done for the sake of a finished product. So when you're, let's say, baking, so use simple examples, when you're baking a loaf of bread, the process is the baking, but the end, the telos of the baking is to produce something like a pie or a loaf of bread. So, and this loaf, of course, is not an activity, it's a thing, it's an object. So in some cases, Aristotle says, when the object is outside or a product of the activity, it's natural, then it's naturally better than the activity itself. There's an uptick in value when something is produced. So what you want to remember is that in all human activities, there is a kind of natural value connected to them. So it's not something that's purely subjective, something that there is a natural value in them. Not all of them, but there can be. That's important for understanding Aristotle. So again, remember, he doesn't say that just because all human activities aim at some good, therefore there is some good that they all aim at. So he doesn't make that inference, because in terms of logic, that's an invalid inference. You can think of that one kind of like the birthday fallacy. Everyone has a birthday, which is true, but you can't say, oh, there's a particular birthday that everyone has. No, that's not true. So you can't go from everyone has a birthday to some birthday everyone has, or every human activity aims at some good, therefore there is a good that all things aim at. But Aristotle being a logician, he recognizes something that's very important that a lot of people miss about logic. It's certainly the case that you can't automatically say that because all human activities aim at some good, that therefore there is a single good that they all aim at. If you ask, is there a single good that we aim at? You can't do it through logic. You've got to go out and look. You've got to ask yourself, well, it's a hint that maybe it's possible there is some good that everything aims at. But I just can't infer it based on the fact that I look at some activities and go, well, they each aim at a good. I can't automatically just jump and say there's a single good that they all aim at. Rather, I have to go out and look at human activities. So what he does, again, as I called Aristotle, a kind of early sociologist, early historian, he goes out and he looks and he asks questions and thinks about what and how do people actually talk. So, in this case now, Aristotle says, if you look around now, all right, so you have to look, you have to check things out. Is it the case that human activities seem to coalesce around certain kinds of goods, and those certain kinds of goods, can they be lumped together in the pursuit of a greater yet still more important or higher kind of or more valuable good? Aristotle says, yeah, it seems to be this. If you look around, it seems, it seems, and he's very tentative, it seems that ends, the tele, the ends, these are clustered. They're related to each other. And they are not only clustered, they're arranged in hierarchies. So what do I mean by that? Well, when we think about doing things, when we're out just doing all kinds of things in the world, nothing fancy, it seems that our values and our ends are clustered into certain hierarchies, and that these hierarchies fit into ever larger ones. So what does that really mean? Well, let's look at a simple example. You may, for instance, and I'm going to use kind of what Aristotle would, examples he would look at. Let's say you sew and you cut leather. Right? Something that would have been around certainly in ancient times. You sew and cut leather. Why? Well, because you work with horses and you're making bridles. So that's your job. You're a bridle maker. You're making these bridles for horses, right? And you need to sew and cut leather. All right, that's fine. So the object, the end, the telos of the sewing and the cutting and all that you're doing with the leather is to create a product, namely a bridle. You may sell it or whatever, or use it. All right. Now you may also, think about this one. You may also learn to ride a horse. Okay, so you go out to the stables and you practice all the things you have to do in order to get up on the horse safely, how to handle the horse if it's unruly, how to ride fast, how to sit, all those kinds of things. So the goal of that would be, all the practicing would be like the piano example, where you get good at, or you get proficient or excellent. Start thinking in terms of excellences now. You become excellent at riding a horse, or you become excellent at making bridles. Now, think about this. The particular ends so the end here is making bridles. Learn to ride a horse. So, horse riding. These ends, Aristotle says, could fit together in a larger pattern. So maybe you are making bridles so that you can learn how to ride a horse, so that the ends, these two ends, are fitting into a larger package. Maybe the reason why you're doing all that is because you want to go on a long vacation. And why do you want to go on a long vacation? Oh, maybe you have to go get something, and the only way you can do it is by, again, we're talking about ancient times. The only thing you can get there is via a horse, so you have to make a bridle and you have to learn how to ride a horse in order to go do something else, for the sake of something further. So ends can come in clusters and hierarchies. So these two might be clustered together, So they're clustered, and they're in a hierarchy because I'm making the bridle and learning how to ride a horse. They're clustered for the sake of going and getting something in another territory. So why am I doing all this down here? Because I want to go pick up something that's over in another part of the country. So these are subordinate ends to some other end, hence the hierarchy, clustering and a hierarchy. And you could think of all kinds of examples in your daily life of why you're doing something here because it's an immediate goal you want to get, but it's for the sake of some larger goal. As a matter of fact, as I said, this is a self-help book. That's what self-help books always say, is arrange your goals into hierarchies and go for the smaller steps on your way to the larger one. Cluster and organize your goals. And that's Aristotle saying, well, that's what we do naturally. That's kind of how the world works. Then the particular ends, now we can think of this slightly differently. The cutting and the sewing of the leather, the riding the horse, this is all part of what Aristotle will call horsemanship. All right, so this is a larger art. The art of horsemanship includes the learning and the proper riding and the making of bridles, etc., etc. Now, here's an important point. It may not be one person doing this. So not only do your ends cluster and form hierarchies, but the ends, for instance, I can't make this video on my own. I have to have Janet help me. So she helps me make this video, and together we're contributing to some finished product. So things can't be done in a vacuum. We need each other, says Aristotle, in order to achieve certain ends. Janet has to do her job, I have to do mine, and the finished product is what you're watching now. So these are all different types of clusters that can be hierarchies that can ultimately be done by different people. So with horsemanship, you can think of this, as Aristotle says, this is part and parcel of a larger thing, a larger art called generalship. So I use the example, let's say, of the ends of horsemanship be subordinate to the art of warfare, which is generalship. So think of, for something, in this case, that generalship would be a larger art, a master art, as compared to the art of making bridles or horse riding. To give you a more concrete example, imagine Napoleon, one of the great generals in history. What's the goal? What's the goal of generalship? The goal, the telos here, is victory. Victory in war. So that's its goal. So there's Napoleon practicing generalship for the goal of victory. And how does he do it? Well, there's lots of pictures of him riding, paintings of him riding a horse, so he's pretty good at that. But I doubt whether he made his own bridles. So he would have had other people doing that. But of course, generalship would not only include sewing and cutting leather done by other people as a subordinate. It would, of course, yes, involve the riding of the horse. But in order to get leather, well, where does leather come from? Well, it comes from animals, it comes from their hides. So that would be connected to things like farming and tanning and all the other subordinate ends that would go into getting the leather to the bridle maker. And of course, the bridle maker would need instruments like a needle, but I doubt if the bridle maker made his or her own needles. That you would need for needles then. That would involve metalwork. Maybe a blacksmith is involved. And of course, all this farming and needles and all these production, all these other things that are going on in the background, they rely on larger contexts and larger contexts. So if you think about Napoleon doing what he's doing his generalship, he would not only just need this and this, he would need an army, he would need basically a society. And you think the whole notion of, again, his victory, well, all of that was connected towards his, as Aristotle would say, his political ends. And that, when you start pulling back and thinking about what are the ultimate ends, it's now not, I use the example of Napoleon, but don't think of it as just an individual. What ultimately governs how all this works, how all these ends and things tie together, is going to be the master science, or the more appropriately, the master art would be politics. So in this sense, right here in the opening pages of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle is linking ethics, which we normally think of as kind of personal, with politics, so the large scale. So in this sense, let's have a look a little bit at the end of the first chapter. And he says this: so the most architectonic art seems to be the political one. What does it do? So I'm just reading the last bit of chapter 1 here. The architect ones are more choice-worthy than all those that fall under them. For these latter, the ones that fall under them, are pursued for the sake of the former. And it makes no difference at all whether the ends of the actions are the activities themselves or something else apart from them. So there's going to be something of ultimate ends, and these are going to be connected to the political. So that wraps up basically chapter 1. Let's look briefly now at chapter 2, because he just slides right into this. And in chapter 2, Aristotle picks up on what he's articulated in chapter 1. So based on his hierarchies, based on this clustering that I've been talking about, and how we seem to set up goals, Aristotle's going to get a little bit more rigorous now. So we've moved away from just some simple observations. He's going to tighten his argument up a bit and try and give a little bit more logic in this to express what he thinks and how he thinks we should think about this. However, he's still rather tentative in his language. So Aristotle says something like this. Well, he speaks in conditionals. He says, if this is the case, then that will follow. If this is true, then that. Well, what does he have now? He says, suppose. So I'm going to paraphrase, but to give you the gist of what Aristotle is about. Suppose that. First off, suppose that there is some end. There is some end or goal, telos, and we'll call it X. There is some goal, telos, and X that we seek. Okay, so we're seeking this. And every other goal, so other goals, shall we say, little a, b, c, etc., are subordinate to that X. So you seek these goals, but you're seeking them in order to get to X. Suppose that is the case. And all these are just means. Means to an end. Okay, there's our end. That's the one we're really after. These guys are just all means. Suppose that is true. He's not saying it's definitely true, but he says probably, likely. What can we conclude? Well, he adds another point in here. So in addition to there being a telos, a goal, or an end that we seek, and all our other goals are just means to it, and that what we desire, this is now as metaphysics comes in. Why do we do things? Well, we desire for things. Desire is a fundamental part of Aristotle's metaphysics. That is the way that the world works. Desire is roughly is a term in Aristotle's physics. We don't use this anymore, but at his time, Aristotle thought that the world ran on desire. Things desired things. We do things because we desire them. Even inanimate objects had unconscious type desires, not the same as us where ours are conscious, but they had certain kinds of desires. Desire made the world go round for Aristotle. So this can be completed. It's possible. Desires can be completed and satisfied. In other words, that we do, in fact, choose and are satisfied with some things. So desires can be completed and they can come to an end. All right. So with this in mind, that we can have our desires in principle satisfied, and that there is some goal that we seek that is not sought for the sake of something else, Aristotle says, well, if this is the case, then it looks pretty good, it looks pretty reasonable that if, remember, suppose that, if this holds, I'm not saying for sure that it does, but if it does hold, it would follow all right, so that's what I mean by a conditional. If this, then that. Is this for sure? Well, maybe. It looks pretty good, but he's not saying absolute. But he's saying, suppose that if this holds, then it would follow that there is an ultimate good. There is some ultimate good or some best thing or some end goal that's preferable to all others. So if Aristotle says, well, okay, if this all works, if this goes through and this is right, then there is some ultimate goal for us. There is something that we all ultimately seek for the sake of itself, right? Not as a means to something else. So, what is this? So if the logic goes through and it seems to hold with our experience, what is this? Wouldn't it be a good idea? Doesn't it seem reasonable to say, well, I'm not sure what it is, but if it's out there, it would be a very good idea for me to figure out what it is, because that is something I can orient my life around. What kinds of goals should be subordinate, and what is this main goal that we should all be looking at? In this sense now, we want to know what it is, and what art, which science, how is that produced? So it's a good idea to figure out what it is and how it's connected to art so we can bring this about. Well, again, Aristotle says, well, if you look at it, again, with all these hierarchies that I talked about in generalship, once again, it looks like it's politics. It's the art of politics that is the master art. So, in that sense, Aristotle ends book 1, chapter 2, with the following. All right. So, the most authoritative, the most architectonic art, the master art, he says, appears to be the political art. Why? For politics, the political art ordains what sciences there must be in cities. So now he's talking about cities, and so collectivities, not just simple clustered ends amongst an individual, but with people, societies in general. So what sciences there must be in cities, what kinds each person in turn must learn, up to what point. So now he's talking about education. So the politics determines education, what people learn, what people take in school. What is, think about it. What is the minimum level of science that you should take in order just to be a citizen? Or the minimum amount of art should be known? That's called a curriculum. Those are politically determined. The master art, politics. And not only does it just apply to large-scale things like educational institutions, universities and schools and things like that. But he goes on. He says that we see that even the most honored capacities, for example, generalship, household management, rhetoric, they fall too under the political art, because it makes use of the remaining sciences and it legislates what one ought to do and abstain from. So politics is the master art and encompasses all the other ones underneath it in making determinations for what everyone should do. So in this sense, politics is something that you're looking at and is directly linked with ethics. So ethics and politics are really of a piece. So he says that in a way, our examination in the Nicomachean Ethics is a political examination. So it was certainly Aristotle that tried to bring together, Plato did this too, but Aristotle tried to bring together that the public side and the private side are indeed very intricately linked. As a matter of fact, it is somewhat arbitrary as to say where one leaves off and the other starts. So politics is your master, art and all things are an examination or a product or something leading up to it. So in that sense, we can see why the Nicomachean Ethics naturally leads into his next book called The Politics. So Aristotle, after he finishes chapter 1 and chapter 2, he takes a bit of a breather and he goes on to talk about methodology. So I'm going to take a breather too, and in the next video I'll come back and talk a little bit about Aristotle on methodology. Stay tuned.